Coming up, Voltaire on his knees, La Victoire sunk, the 800-mile marathon. Welcome to Living Lafayette. For the Lafayette Alliance in LaGrange, Georgia, I'm Richard Ingram. The Comte de Ségur got married on April the 30th, 1777. He married Adrienne's mother's youngest sister. She was only 3 years older than Adrienne, and technically this would make Ségur Lafayette's uncle by marriage. Ségur's two best friends were not there. The Vicomte de Noailles had raced off to Marseille to meet Lafayette and the Duc d'Enghien, their father-in-law, together with the Duke's sister, the Comtesse de Tesse, and her husband, the Comte de Tesse, for a holiday to Italy. Well, when Noailles arrived, Lafayette was not there. 10 days before, Lafayette had weighed anchor in Las Paseas, Spain, aboard La Victoire, and he was out on the Atlantic, headed to America. And word got around. Lord Stormont, the English ambassador to Paris, registered his complaint about Lafayette's enterprise with Prime Minister Maurepas. Got no satisfaction. So Stormont then went to Foreign Minister Vergennes, likewise. Back to Maurepas, back to Vergennes. All Stormont got was a lot of shoulder shrugging. Boys will be boys. The Duc d'Enghien was miffed, but not a whole lot he could do about it. He was at Marseille, after all, about to go to Italy. But his father, the Maréchal de Noailles, went to Prime Minister Maurepas to say that the family, they were concerned about Lafayette, but they were also concerned about the Marquis de Noailles, who was Adrienne's uncle, who was the ambassador to the court of St. James in London. Lafayette had, after all, gone to London, been wined and dined, met King George III, and now this. So they were concerned about the repercussions to the Marquis de Noailles. Well, Maurepas and Vergennes assured the Maréchal de Noailles and the Duc d'Enghien and other family members, including the Marquis de Noailles, that Lafayette's truancy wouldn't reflect ill on them. Adrienne got Lafayette's letter that he had written the day before he sailed. The worst part of it was the unknown. When would he return? And the rumor mill, the social media of the time, informing Adrienne about all the dire consequences of Lafayette going to America. She tried to be stoic and not pay any attention. She buttonholed Count Pulaski, who was coming from Poland and through Paris in May and on his way to America to offer his services to the Continental Army. Adrienne asked Count Pulaski to deliver a letter to Lafayette. And in the meantime, she was taking care of her 2-year-old, Henriette, who was in poor health and would die come October, in fact. And she was pregnant. Adrienne gave birth on July 1st to Anastasie Louise Pauline. Lafayette would not learn of these things until December, in fact. Family was also concerned about how Lafayette was going to support himself in America. By the end of the year, Lafayette had spent 140,000 livres. He had racked up 170,000 livres in IOUs. It's hard to tell what that is worth today. My guess is $8 or $9 to the livre, but it's pure guess. They did send him 500 pounds sterling. They didn't send him any more. They were reluctant to do that. They were afraid his generosity would burn through the bank account. Benjamin Franklin wrote George Washington and asked Washington to offer fatherly advice to Lafayette, to lend him money if need be, and not to hazard him too much in the way of battle. Silas Deane wrote Robert Morris, who was America's financier, who incidentally eventually would go bankrupt and serve time in debtor's prison. But Deane asked Morris to be Lafayette's banker, and Deane also wrote the Continental Congress, suggesting that Lafayette was a valuable asset and to treat him accordingly. The Duc d'Enghien, when he got back from his trip to Italy, found that his son-in-law was now a celebrity. Horace Walpole wrote very favorably of Lafayette. Benjamin Franklin, of course, and Edward Gibbon, author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 6 volumes, 1776 to 1788, had very favorable things to say about Lafayette and his daring. And the best of all was Voltaire. Voltaire was a cranky fellow. He wrote essays, books, plays. He was very critical of the Catholic Church, and of course France was Catholic, and very critical of the monarchy. And France had an absolute monarchy. In fact, in 1754, King Louis XV banned Voltaire from Paris. Voltaire went to the French-Swiss border, purchased a Chateau Ferney on the French side, lived there for 25 years. But in 1778, triumphal return. Voltaire came back to Paris. Now, at that time, he was 84 years old. He was very frail. He was at a reception, Voltaire was, at the Duc de Choisille's home. Adrienne was there, among other people. But as soon as Voltaire saw Adrienne, and this comes from 2 separate accounts, Voltaire fell to his knees in homage to Adrienne and to her very daring husband. 84 years old and frail. We don't have any descriptions about how exactly he got to his knees. I hear bones cracking myself, but apparently no orthopedic catastrophe. Surely they helped him to get up, and he died not long afterwards. Lafayette, for his part, was at sea and seasick much of the time. He tried to make productive use of his time. He studied English with Baron de Kalb, who spoke French, English, and German, and with Edmund Bryce, who was from Annapolis, Maryland. He studied military strategy and tactics with the other French officers, all of whom had more experience than he. And Baron de Kalb took to calling this group of military officers the caravan. And Lafayette wrote letters, knowing that he couldn't send them before he reached land and could get them on a ship headed back to France. On June 7, 1777, still at sea, he wrote Adrienne. And it was in that letter that he said this: "The welfare of America is intimately connected with the happiness of all mankind. She'll become the respectable and safe asylum of virtue, integrity, tolerance, equality, and a peaceful liberty." There are those who argue that Lafayette, at that time, at that age, could not grasp the gravity of that terminology. But the soil had been tilled. Lafayette and William Carmichael particularly had discussed those terms, had discussed liberty, equality, and justice. Motivations are difficult things. They're tough to discern. Certainly for Lafayette, vengeance could have been one motivation. After all, his father died at the Battle of Minden by a cannonball from an artillery regiment commanded by William Phillips, an Englishman. Certainly glory. Lafayette, from a young age, wanted to do something worthy that benefited community for which he'd be recognized. But maybe those motivations, they're more easily said, they're more easily received. The idea that principle could be a motivation is a tougher sell. The idea that liberty, equality, and justice could have been one of the reasons, at least, that Lafayette was en route to America may be harder to discern. My sense, however, is that Lafayette was using those terms deliberately, and they were not flippant in his mind. Eventually, Lafayette began seeing birds coming out, and so they knew that land was not far away. And eventually they came within sight of the harbor there at Charleston. And cruising that harbor were two English frigates. As fate would have it, a robust wind came up, blew those two French frigates south, but at the same time blew Lafayette north, some 75 miles north of Charleston. On a Friday, June 13, 1777, Lafayette dropped anchor at the south inlet of North Island, there at Georgetown Harbor, right at the mouth of the Great Peedee River. At about 2 o'clock that afternoon, they dropped a launch. Lafayette, DeKalb, 7 other oarsmen, the ship's mate, and Edmund Bryce got into the launch and headed for land. The first Americans they met were African Americans in a canoe out oystering. They were slaves who belonged to Major Benjamin Huger, who was in the South Carolina militia. And Huger had a summer home nearby. Well, the slaves agreed they would lead the launch to Major Huger's home. At about 10 p.m. that night, the tide went out, and that launch got mired in mud. It was stuck. So Lafayette, DeKalb, and Edmund Bryce loaded into the canoe, and then they forged on ahead to Major Huger's. They arrived at about midnight. Major Huger at first thought these were redcoats. But after everyone introduced themselves opposite a closed door, Major Huger invited them in and was very cordial. Lafayette was impressed. Here it was, midnight, foreigners, and yet a welcome and cordiality. And Lafayette got a chance to meet Major Huger's son, 3-year-old Francis Kinloch Huger. Francis Kinloch would play a role later in Lafayette's life when Lafayette was imprisoned. As fate would have it, for Francis Kinloch was helpful in the escape from Olmutz. That story later. Major Huger told Lafayette and team that Charleston was about 60 miles straight south, and Major Huger would supply horses to get there. Lafayette and team spent the night, what was left of it, there at Major Huger's, and then the tide came back in the next morning. They loaded the launch and back to Lafayette. They decided that they would go to Charleston in 2 contingents. One would be overland, Lafayette and DeKalb leading that crew. The other would be by way of Lafayette. Vicomte de Monroy would try to navigate Lafayette around into Charleston Harbor and past those 2 English cruisers that were patrolling the harbor. So overland it was for Lafayette and DeKalb, battling heat and big mosquitoes. That was a new experience for Lafayette. They arrived in Charleston on Monday. It was June 16th. Lafayette was not there. Charlestonians had seen Frenchmen before. They considered them arrogant, and so they paid little attention to this bedraggled bunch that had come in from Georgetown. The following day, on Tuesday, those 2 French frigates were still out patrolling the harbor, but robust wind came in and blew those frigates out of the harbor, and at about 10 a.m., in sailed Lafayette. And word got around. This ship is owned by the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette became a celebrity. There were only two other marquises in America at the time, Marquis de Malmedy and Marquis de Rouet, who went by Colonel Armand. But they didn't have the certificates that Lafayette did. So Lafayette was now wined and dined. He met Generals Robert Howe and William Moultrie, who were heroes of the Battle of Sullivan's Island, June 28, 1776. He met John Rutledge, who was president of the South Carolina Provincial Assembly. Lafayette was just impressed. What a country, he thought. Here people, they were friendly, they had this willingness to oblige and love of country and liberty. And Lafayette, he stayed in the inns there. And the owners would sit down to break bread with the ones who were staying at the inn. This was different. This was a new experience for Lafayette. In Europe, it didn't work that way. The two were separated. And the cost. The cost was the cost in America. There was no haggling. What a country, thought Lafayette. He also met Christopher Gadsden. Gadsden was a brigadier general in charge of the South Carolina militia and also the designer of the Gadsden flag. Yellow background, a timber rattlesnake coiled, 13 rattlers, and at the bottom, "Don't tread on me." So it was a good metaphor for the colonies. A rattlesnake is fairly docile. You leave it alone. If it gets agitated, well, it strikes. Lafayette was so impressed that he agreed to outfit 100 men, uniforms, munitions, arms, $5,500. It was a big deal, and word of that got around. Lafayette had anticipated that he would be able to sell La Victoire and its cargo, and then he and his colleagues could live off the bounty for 2 or 3 years. When they were first coming over at Bordeaux, La Victoire had registered as going to Le Cap, Santo Domingo. Most ships, when they're coming to America, didn't come straight across to America. They triangulated. They went down to the West Indies, they restocked, and then went to America. And unknown to Lafayette, Captain Laboisier had stowed $8,000 worth of goods down in the hold, which Laboisier intended to sell at Le Cap and then pocket the profits. So when Lafayette told Laboisier to sail straight for Charleston, Laboisier balked. When Lafayette and the French officers threatened to commandeer the ship, well, Laboisier reluctantly agreed. Charleston it was. Lafayette found out why Laboisier was reluctant. That $8,000 worth of cargo. One would think Lafayette would have chastised, would have dressed Laboisier down. That was not Lafayette's approach. Lafayette promised Laboisier that if he suffered any losses in selling that cargo at Charleston, he, Lafayette, would make up the difference. Laboisier was reluctant no more. They sailed on Charleston. 54 days at sea from Las Paseas, 80 days from Bordeaux. So now at Charleston, they did sell what was in the hold, what was in the cargo. And Lafayette intended to sell La Victoire, but Lafayette had not read the contract with Pierre Basmarin, who supplied the boat, carefully. The contract said that Lafayette could sell cargo, but then was obligated to reload fresh cargo and send the whole of it back to Bordeaux, where Basmarin could sell the cargo and the ship, retain what was owed him with interest, and Basmarin had insured the ship at Bordeaux, and he would recruit what the cost was to insure. Well, fine. Lafayette sold the cargo, took out a high-interest loan at 36,000 livres, reloaded the ship, La Victoire, with rice, insured it with an American insurer, and then sent it on out its way, out of Charleston Harbor. La Victoire struck shoals, exiting Charleston Harbor, wrecked, sank. Lafayette went back to his American insurer. The insurer said, wait a minute, this is also insured at Bordeaux. That must be reconciled. It never was reconciled eventually. Lafayette did his best. 9 days in Charleston, it was time to get on the way. They needed to head to Philadelphia. They were going to Philadelphia in order to get their commissions endorsed and certified by the Continental Congress. You remember Silas Deane had given them these military commissions, and Deane had not been authorized to do that. So their commissions had to be endorsed by the Continental Congress. So finally, after 9 days in Charleston, they headed toward Philadelphia, 800 miles. They went in 3 contingents. One led overland in carriages by Lafayette and DeKalb. The second, Vicomte de Monroy. The third, a contingent decided they'd take their chances at sea. They would board a commercial vessel and head up to Philadelphia. The chance they were taking was getting caught by the English. So they headed out in this train of carriages and horses, and taking up the backside of the caravan was a black gentleman. We don't know the story about how that came to be. Diane Wyndham Shaw of the American Friends of Lafayette suggests that one of the families there at Charleston made this arrangement, but we know nothing more about that story. So they headed now north to Charleston, first to New Bern, North Carolina, Halifax, North Carolina, Petersburg, Virginia, and then Annapolis, Maryland. This was Edmund Bryce's home, and they spent the night of July 23rd, July 24th at Annapolis. There is a mystery that occurred at Annapolis. There's a document in the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and it has writing on 2 sides. And here is what the writing on the first side says, the front of the document. For August 1777, promised to pay Dr. Murray the sum of 180 pounds currency for value received of him for the use of Marquis de Lafayette, as witness my hand and seal, Edmund Bryce. And then it has Bryce's seal on it. The other side reads this, the backside. Edmund Bryce's note to Dr. Murray for a Negro boy for the Marquis, August 4, 1777, paid by James Bryce. James Bryce was Edmund's brother. James Murphy was a physician there in Annapolis. We know nothing else about this story. Stanley Atzerda does record a letter written by Henry Laurens, soon to be president of the Continental Congress, to Lafayette on October 23rd of that year, and it says this: I've not seen the French gentleman who did me the honor to bring your letter, but will inquire of your black servants where he may be found, and you may depend on me, sir, to attempt at least to serve him. Nor shall the subject concerning Mr. Valfort depart from my mind. It is unclear whether these two are related in any way. It is unclear whether Lafayette's hand was really in it. Mike Duncan, in his book, does choose to highlight this event. Lafayette never wrote about it. Duncan says that Lafayette didn't write about it because he was ashamed of it. And it's interesting that Adam Gopnik, in his review in the New Yorker of Duncan's book, also highlights this episode and the assumption made that Lafayette had his hand in it, that Lafayette executed this. But that's not what the document says. Anything beyond what this says is speculation. It's also interesting that Lafayette was young, he was impressionable, this was new experience, he was a letter writer, but he never wrote anything about this. So this is part of the mystery, unknown, until we get more data on it. So, from Annapolis, by boat to Baltimore, and then from Baltimore to Philadelphia, where they would be disappointed. This is Living Lafayette. To discover, to inform, to entertain. Till next time.